In the golden era of American muscle, horsepower wasn't just a number, it was a declaration. In that tempest of competition, one brand stood poised to break the mold: Pontiac. While Chevrolet and Ford basked in the glory of their racing programs, Pontiac was often left fighting a war on two fronts, one against its corporate overlords at General Motors, and another on the racetracks where it wasn't even allowed to compete, officially. This is the true story of the Pontiac 303 Ram Air V, the engine that was too powerful, too controversial, and too ambitious to survive. Beneath the surface, away from public eyes and far from boardroom approval, a team of Pontiac engineers began to craft a weapon so radical and so advanced that it could have changed the future of Trans Am racing forever. It was known simply as the 303, but those who understood what it really was referred to it by a more infamous name: Ram Air V. An experimental, tunnel port-headed, high-revving small block designed for one purpose: to win. But Pontiac's 303 Trans Am engine never got its chance. It was banned before it ever turned a lap in sanctioned competition. What happened to the 303? Why did GM, the most powerful car company in America, allow it to be built in secret? And why did they suddenly kill it? To understand the origins of the 303 project, we first need to step back into the political climate of 1963, when General Motors implemented a sweeping corporate ban on racing. In an internal decision that echoed through every division, GM's upper management prohibited all official involvement in competitive motorsports. The idea was that racing had become too expensive, too dangerous, and too politically risky for a corporation with the size and public exposure of GM. This decision frustrated one man more than most: John Z. DeLorean, who at the time was head of Pontiac's advanced engineering and performance programs. DeLorean, a brilliant and rebellious figure within GM, had no interest in playing by the rules. He saw the ban as a challenge to be subverted. And so, Pontiac quietly shifted its motorsports involvement underground. Instead of building factory race cars, they began creating heavy-duty parts for off-road use. These components, engines, blocks, heads, and drivetrains, were sold through back channels and internal part codes. DeLorean's philosophy was simple: Pontiac wouldn't race, but its customers could, and Pontiac would make sure they had the parts to win. This gave rise to Pontiac's secret weapon, the Special Projects Engineering Team. It was a skunkworks division embedded within Pontiac's engineering department. It was unofficial. It wasn't listed on flowcharts, but it was real. The team included brilliant minds like Herb Adams, Tom Nell, and Jeff Young, engineers who had one foot in the corporate world and another in the underground world of racing innovation. Their mission was straightforward: build a small block Pontiac engine that could dominate the new SCCA Trans Am series. The rules were clear. Engines had to be based on factory blocks. Displacement was limited to 305 cubic inches. And perhaps most critically, in order for any engine to be legal for competition, a minimum of 250 production units had to be built and offered for sale to the public. This was the homologation requirement, a rule designed to keep the sport connected to the showroom floor. Chevrolet, with its 302 small block, found instant success in Trans Am through the Z/28 Camaro. Ford countered with the 289 and later the 302 Boss engine, which used a tunnel port head design to deliver both top-end power and endurance performance. Pontiac, however, was at a disadvantage. Their smallest V8 was a 326, and their architecture was bulky and heavy. They had no production-ready small block that could match Ford or Chevy within the 305 cubic inch limit. But Herb Adams and his team weren't about to let that stop them. Their solution was to develop an entirely new engine architecture, albeit based loosely on Pontiac's traditional big block design. But it would be shorter, lighter, rev-happier, and radically re-engineered. Thus, the Pontiac 303 Trans Am engine was born. The foundation of the engine was an all-new block with a short deck height, shaved down from Pontiac's traditional 10.25 inches to just around 8.2 inches, closer in proportion to a Ford small block. The shorter deck allowed for a smaller and lighter rotating assembly, critical for meeting the 305 cubic inch displacement limit, and for achieving higher RPMs without catastrophic stress. The stroke was reduced dramatically to just 2.84 inches, coupled with a bore of 4.12 inches. This over-square design was ideal for high RPM racing. The short stroke minimized piston speed and stress at the top of the rev range, which would allow the engine to spin safely beyond 7,500 RPM. But the most radical innovation was in the cylinder heads. Pontiac's team, recognizing the success of Ford's tunnel port head design in Trans Am, took a bold step and developed their own version, a set of tunnel port-style heads, internally referred to as Ram Air V. These were massive high-rise intake ports that flowed over 325 CFM in their early dyno versions, unheard of numbers for the time. The Ram Air V heads were unlike anything Pontiac had ever produced. The intake runners were so large that the pushrods had to pass through the port in separate tubes, just like Ford's design. The valves were large and canted, and the combustion chambers were hemispherical in nature. The entire system was designed with one goal in mind: unrestricted high RPM airflow. The engine was dry-sump lubricated, a racing-grade feature that prevented oil starvation under hard cornering and allowed the engine to sit lower in the chassis for a better center of gravity. The crankshaft and rods were forged, the pistons were custom. The camshaft was an aggressive solid lifter design. This wasn't just a hopped-up street motor, it was a purebred racing engine. On the dyno, the early 303 prototypes made between 453 and 475 horsepower at over 7,500 RPM. Some reports claim they achieved more than 530 horsepower at 8,200 RPM in final trim. That was extraordinary for the displacement, especially in 1969. But there was a problem. Despite the incredible top-end horsepower, the Ram Air V heads created a massive torque vacuum at low and mid RPMs. The huge ports couldn't generate sufficient air velocity below 4,000 RPM, which made the engine sluggish off the line and underwhelming out of corners. As Pontiac engineer Tom Nell would later explain, "We had all the airflow in the world, but no usable torque band." And in road racing, torque out of corners mattered as much, if not more, than peak power on the straightaways. The brilliance of Pontiac's 303 Ram Air V engine wasn't enough on its own. For the engine to see action in the SCCA Trans Am series, it had to satisfy a key requirement: homologation. This wasn't just red tape, it was the cornerstone of the series, intended to ensure that manufacturers couldn't game the system with one-off race specials. The rule was clear: at least 250 units of any engine and accompanying parts had to be produced and made publicly available in production vehicles. Pontiac was racing against the clock. The 303 had been greenlit internally, but not through formal channels. There were no plans to drop it into a mass production vehicle. In fact, the engine itself, especially in short deck form, had no production precedent whatsoever. It wasn't a bored or stroked version of an existing Pontiac engine. It was a totally new animal. That meant everything had to be built from scratch, and in secret. According to surviving Pontiac records and internal memos, somewhere between 20 and 25 complete short-deck 303 engines were ever assembled. Some were dyno tested, others went into developmental Firebirds, and a few ended up in the hands of privateers. But the minimum requirement of 250 units for Trans Am legality was never fulfilled. No amount of internal fudging or creative accounting could disguise the truth. The engine was not homologated. This spelled doom. Without homologation, the 303 could not legally compete in SCCA-sanctioned Trans Am races. The entire purpose of the engine, its radical design, its sky-high RPM ceiling, and its years of quiet development meant nothing if the car it was built for wasn't allowed on the grid. The disappointment was palpable. Pontiac had thrown everything at the project, despite corporate resistance. Now, they were being told it was dead on arrival, and the clock was ticking on the entire Pontiac performance program. While Pontiac scrambled to meet homologation thresholds, SCCA changed the rules, and not in their favor. Ahead of the 1970 Trans Am season, the SCCA revised its eligibility guidelines, now requiring that all homologated engines be offered in actual production vehicles, not just sold over the counter as parts. This seemingly subtle change was a death sentence for Pontiac's 303. They had never planned to put the engine into a production Firebird or GTO. The short deck block wasn't compatible with existing factory tooling, and the Ram Air V heads were too extreme for street use. The engine had always been designed for race use only, distributed quietly through channels protected from GM's anti-racing policy. The SCCA's rule change exposed that approach. Now Pontiac couldn't even claim it was working toward compliance. The 303 was effectively disqualified before it ever had a chance to compete. To make matters worse, Pontiac's part suppliers began to fail. Components for the 303's unique architecture, like dry-sump systems, intake manifolds, and custom valve train parts, were being produced by low-volume vendors. But with no guarantee of racing success or production vehicle integration, those vendors had little incentive to continue development. By mid-1970, supply chain support for the 303 had all but collapsed. And then came the biggest blow. GM pulled the plug. By 1971, the federal government had begun imposing strict emissions regulations. Insurance companies were hiking premiums on high-performance vehicles. Public sentiment was turning against muscle cars. The age of fire-breathing V8s was ending, and GM's leadership knew it. Performance programs across all divisions were cut, budgets were slashed, racing support dried up. The 303 was dead. Although Pontiac's 303 engine was officially cancelled, a small number of its components survived. Most of the roughly 25 complete engines were dismantled or repurposed. Some Ram Air V heads found their way onto larger displacement race engines, 400, 428, and even 455. Others sat on storage shelves in engineering labs, quietly aging into obscurity. Only a handful of complete 303s are known to exist today. One of them was installed in Herb Adams' personal car, an experimental 1969 Firebird nicknamed the Gray Ghost, which he campaigned in amateur road races well into the 1970s. Another made its way into a prototype Firebird Trans Am test mule, built by Pontiac's internal engineering team before the project was officially killed. Beyond that, most known examples of Ram Air V 303 engines today are recreations or assemblies built from leftover parts, sourced from back rooms, swap meets, and former Pontiac engineers' private collections. Because Pontiac never released a full factory car with the 303 installed, and because the short deck block was never available to the public, these engines have taken on almost mythical status in the collector world. In retrospect, the 303 Trans Am engine represents one of the greatest what-if stories in American automotive history. It was a bold, dangerous project, engineered in defiance of corporate policy, pushed to the limits of metallurgy and airflow theory, and intended to bring Pontiac back to the top of American road racing. But in its ambition, it was also flawed. While the Pontiac 303 cubic inch version of the Ram Air V became the most famous and mysterious variant, it was never the only one. In fact, the Ram Air V project as a whole was designed to be scalable across multiple displacements. Pontiac's engineers created versions for 303, 366, 400, 428, and even 455 cubic inch applications. These engines all shared the same radical cylinder head architecture: tall intake ports, straight shot runners, canted valves, and push rods that passed through aluminum tubes inside the intake path, a complex engineering workaround pioneered by Ford's 427 tunnel port race engines years earlier. According to surviving Pontiac parts catalogs and engineering documentation, fewer than 200 complete Ram Air V engines were ever built across all displacements, and most were sold through Pontiac's service and racing channels, not installed in vehicles from the factory. That's why, to this day, there are 0 known production vehicles that left the assembly line with a Ram Air V engine installed. This was a deliberate action. GM's 1963 anti-racing edict prevented divisions like Pontiac from openly promoting motorsports involvement. That policy didn't officially change until the early 1970s, and even then, Pontiac was already being steered toward emissions compliance and fuel economy initiatives. What this means is that every Ram Air V-equipped car you see today, whether it's a Firebird, GTO, or Tempest, is either a dealer-installed setup, an aftermarket assembly, or a privateer race car, built by customers using Pontiac's over-the-counter performance parts. These were known as off-road use-only packages in GM's documentation, a legal loophole that allowed racing parts to be sold without violating the corporate ban. In the decades since, these rare components have been tracked down by Pontiac enthusiasts, some of whom have spent years or even decades assembling complete Ram Air-V engines from original factory cast parts. One of the most notable restorers is Jim Wangers, widely regarded as the godfather of the GTO and one of Pontiac's most important marketing figures in the 1960s. While Wangers was more involved with street performance than racing development, he remained a champion of the Ram Air-V concept well into the 1980s and beyond. He confirmed in interviews that Pontiac had the talent and engineering depth to make it work, but corporate politics got in the way. Another key figure is Herb Adams, the original engineer behind the 303 program and the man who later founded his own racing outfit, Herb Adams. Adams is perhaps the most direct link to the 303's development. His personal car, a modified 1964 Tempest known as the Grey Ghost, was outfitted with a version of the Ram Air-V and campaigned in amateur and semi-professional road races throughout the 1970s. In interviews, Adams stated that while the 303 was a challenge to tune, it absolutely had the potential to compete with the Boss 302 and Chevy 302Z/28 if development had continued. The big question that still hangs over the 303 Ram Air-V is this: how would it have performed in actual competition? Thanks to modern recreations and dyno testing from Pontiac builders like Butler Performance and Kaufman Racing Equipment, we now have real-world data on how these engines behave, both in their original 303 configuration and in stroked versions. Tests using reproduction, Ram Air-V heads on a true short-deck 303 block have shown that the engine can reliably produce 450 to 470 horsepower at 7,500 plus RPM, using a properly tuned solid lifter camshaft and dry-sump lubrication system. However, even today's expert tuners admit that the torque curve is narrow, and the power band only truly comes alive above 5,500 RPM. That's not ideal for street use or even road racing, unless the transmission and gearing are perfectly matched. Today, the 303 Ram Air-V engine sits in a rare category of American muscle car history. It wasn't just banned, it was suppressed, erased, and quietly buried. Unlike the Chevy ZL1 or the Boss 429, which saw limited production and track time, the 303 was cancelled before it ever truly launched. And yet, the aura around it has only grown stronger. The real tragedy is that it was killed not by competition, not by failure, but by politics. The engineers did their job and the dyno numbers were there. The performance potential was unquestioned. What wasn't there was the corporate will to back it and the regulatory room to let it race. To fully appreciate why the Pontiac 303 Ram Air-V mattered and why its cancellation stung so deeply, we need to place it alongside its two main rivals, the Ford Boss 302 and the Chevrolet 302Z/28. Both of these engines were specifically engineered for SCCA Trans Am racing. Both met the 5.0-liter displacement limit, and both were successfully homologated into production vehicles. And unlike Pontiac's 303, both of them actually went racing, and won. Let's start with the Chevy 302. Created by pairing a 4.00-inch bore 327 block with a 3.00-inch stroke 283 crankshaft, the 302 was introduced in 1967 as the heart of the Camaro Z/28. It was a street-legal homologation special with a solid lifter camshaft, free-flowing heads, and a high-revving nature that made it perfect for road racing. The engine made an advertised 290 horsepower, but in reality it produced well over 360 to 400 horsepower at 6,800 RPM in stock form. Chevy sold enough of them to meet SCCA's homologation rule, making the Z/28 fully eligible for Trans Am competition from the beginning. Then there was Ford's Boss 302, introduced in 1969. It was a blend of Windsor and Cleveland architecture, using a 302 small block bottom end with Cleveland-style canted valve heads. The result was a rev-happy, high-flowing V8 that made an advertised 290 horsepower, though again, actual output was closer to 375 to 390 horsepower. Ford mass-produced the Boss 302 and equipped their Mustang-based race cars accordingly, meeting all SCCA requirements. Now compare this to Pontiac's 303. On paper, it was the most advanced of the three. The Ram Air V-heads flowed better than either the Cleveland or Chevy's double-hump castings. And while Ford and Chevy had corporate approval and budget support to produce their engines in the required quantities, Pontiac never had that luxury. GM's internal racing ban made it impossible to secure the same resources. So, while the 303 may have won the dyno wars, it never got the chance to prove itself where it really mattered, on the track. The most valuable insights into the 303 come from the men who built it. Herb Adams, the leader of Pontiac's Special Projects Group, has spoken openly about the 303 in interviews over the decades. In a 2001 feature for High Performance Pontiac magazine, Adams confirmed, "The Ram Air V program was an attempt to compete with Ford's tunnel port engine on a technical level. We knew we couldn't match their production numbers, but we could match or beat their airflow. That's where the 303 came from." Adams also acknowledged the challenges of making the engine tractable for road racing. "It worked really well up high, but in real-world racing, you need torque when you're coming out of a corner. The heads were great, but too much of a good thing can hurt you." Another Pontiac engineer, Tom Nell, echoed that sentiment in a 2005 CarCraft interview. He explained, "People thought the Ram Air V was going to be the holy grail. But even in the bigger engines, it had a narrow window. It loved RPM, but wasn't street-friendly. The 303 in particular was tricky. The short deck block limited intake choices and created packaging issues." Perhaps the most poignant testimony comes from Jeff Young, one of the team's junior engineers at the time, who worked on early 303 test engines. He later said, "It was fast. It sounded like nothing else. It just needed more time. And time was the one thing we didn't have." These quotes aren't hearsay. They come from recorded interviews, preserved in reputable automotive journalism, and backed by dyno sheets, engineering memos, and part catalogs. So where does this leave us? The Pontiac 303 Ram Air V was not a myth or vaporware. It was a real engine, designed, built, tested, and dyno verified by some of the most brilliant minds in Pontiac's history. It was born in secrecy, developed under pressure, and buried before it could breathe. Its greatest strength, its uncompromising design, was also its fatal flaw. By going all in on airflow and high RPM horsepower, the 303 sacrificed the flexibility that made its competitors so successful. And without GM's full support or SCCA eligibility, it simply had no future. Today, surviving components from Ram Air V programs, especially short-deck 303 blocks and tunnel port heads, are among the most sought-after Pontiac artifacts on the planet. They're not just valuable because they're rare. They're valuable because they represent something Pontiac never got to do: fight on equal ground. Because the 303 never made it into mass production, public sightings of a complete original engine are exceptionally rare. However, one known example of a 303-based Ram Air V engine was displayed at the Pontiac Oakland Museum in Pontiac, Illinois, as part of a special exhibit on experimental Pontiac performance projects. The engine on display was a cutaway model that showed the unique tunnel port intake runners and the internal pushrod tube system. According to museum curator Tim Dye, the display was intended to showcase the height of Pontiac's racing innovation before the corporate lid came down. Other original parts, including 303 crankshafts, pistons, and Ram Air V heads, have appeared in major auctions such as Mecum and Barrett-Jackson, where they have sold for between $8,000 and $20,000 per component, depending on condition and documentation. The Ram Air V exists in a kind of mythical shadow. It's real, but so few people have seen one in person that it's often misunderstood or dismissed as a legend. The story of the Pontiac 303 Trans Am engine isn't just about racing. It's a snapshot of a turning point in American automotive history, a moment when innovation collided with regulation, when engineering talent was stifled by boardroom caution, and when greatness was buried not because it failed, but because it scared the system too much. And so, the Pontiac 303 remains what it always was, a forbidden weapon, built in the shadows, silenced before it could roar. Today, it lives on in whispers, in museum exhibits, in garage builds powered by passion, and in the minds of those who still believe that sometimes the best engines are the ones that never got to race.